The Nexus Station cantina buzzed with the usual mix of alien conversations, atmospheric processors humming, and the occasional crash of broken glass. Located in the neutral zone between three major galactic territories, the station attracted every species imaginable. Traders, mercenaries, diplomats, and those who preferred to avoid questions about their cargo all gathered here. Zach Thull stood nearly 8 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the dim purple lights. As a Vextar warrior, he commanded respect wherever he went. His species had conquered 17 star systems through pure physical dominance. Their natural armor could deflect plasma bolts, their claws could tear through steel, and their strength was legendary throughout the galaxy. Tonight, Zach Thull felt particularly aggressive. His hunting clan had just completed a successful raid on a Krillian supply convoy, and the spoils had been distributed among the warriors. The adrenaline still coursed through his system, making him eager for confrontation. The cantina's patrons gave him a wide berth as he moved toward the central bar area. A group of Talaxian merchants quickly vacated their seats when they saw him approaching. Even the bar's security drones seemed to maintain extra distance from the imposing figure. "Bartender!" Zach Thull's voice boomed across the establishment, his words translated by the universal communication system. "Bring me your strongest Vextar battle brew. The real stuff, not the watered-down version you serve to these soft-skinned weaklings." The Nexian bartender, a gelatinous being with multiple eye stalks, trembled slightly as it prepared the order. Vextar Battle Brew was notoriously potent, capable of intoxicating most species with just a few drops. For a Vextar warrior, however, it merely provided a pleasant buzz. As Zach Thull waited for his drink, he surveyed the cantina with predatory interest. Near the back wall, a group of Centaurian diplomats discussed trade agreements in hushed tones. At a corner table, several Zephyrian pilots shared stories of their latest cargo runs. The usual collection of species, all going about their business while carefully avoiding eye contact with him. Then, something caught his attention. At the far end of the bar sat a lone figure that Zach Thull didn't immediately recognize. The being appeared relatively small, perhaps 5.5 feet in height, with pale skin and strange patches of fur growing only from the top of its head. It wore simple clothing and seemed completely absorbed in consuming what appeared to be some kind of fermented beverage. Zach Thull's compound eyes focused on the creature with interest. He had encountered hundreds of species during his military campaigns, but this one seemed unfamiliar. More intriguing was the fact that it appeared completely relaxed, showing none of the usual fear responses he was accustomed to seeing. The Vextar warrior collected his battle brew and approached the stranger. As he drew closer, he noticed several empty containers on the bar in front of the small being. Whatever species this was, it apparently had a considerable capacity for alcohol consumption. "You there, strange one," Zach Thull called out, his voice carrying easily across the ambient noise. "What manner of creature are you? I don't recognize your species." The being turned slowly, revealing a face with 2 forward-facing eyes, a small nose, and what appeared to be some kind of mouth. When it spoke, its voice was surprisingly calm and friendly. "Oh, hey there, big guy. I'm human. Name's Jake Thompson. Just passing through on my way to the Outer Rim territories." The human raised his drink in a casual greeting gesture. "Haven't seen your species before either. You're pretty impressive looking." Zach Thull felt a moment of confusion. In his experience, smaller species either fled immediately upon seeing a Vextar warrior or attempted to show submission through various cultural displays. This human seemed genuinely unconcerned by his presence. "Human," Zach Thull repeated the unfamiliar word. "I have not heard of your people. Are you a warrior species? You seem remarkably calm for something so small and fragile." Jake chuckled, taking another sip of his drink. "Fragile? Well, I suppose we're not the toughest-looking bunch in the galaxy. We're actually pretty new to this whole interstellar community thing. Just got our first FTL drives working about 50 years ago." This information made Zach Thull even more curious. A species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel should be terrified of established galactic powers. Yet this human showed no signs of intimidation whatsoever. 50 years. Zach Thull moved closer, towering over the seated human. My people have been conquering star systems for over a millennium. We are apex predators, feared throughout this sector of the galaxy. You should show proper respect. Jake looked up at the massive alien with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than fear. Apex predators? That's pretty cool. We got those back on Earth too, though they're mostly smaller than you. Lions, tigers, great white sharks, that sort of thing. The human paused, seeming to consider something. You know, it's funny you should mention being feared throughout the sector. I was just thinking this seemed like a pretty peaceful place. Zach Thull's mandibles clicked in what other Vextar would recognize as amusement, though the sound came across as distinctly threatening to most species. This human's casual attitude was beginning to irritate him. Did it not understand the natural order of things? Peaceful. Zach Thull leaned closer, bringing his full height to bear as he loomed over the human. This station is peaceful because beings like me maintain order through strength. The weak know their place and behave accordingly. Jake nodded thoughtfully, apparently unfazed by having 8 feet of armored predator breathing down on him. That makes sense, I guess. Back where I come from, we had a similar system for a while. Big guys kept the little guys in line through intimidation and violence. Exactly, Zach Thull said, pleased that the humans seemed to grasp the fundamental truth of galactic society. Your species understands the natural hierarchy. That shows wisdom, even if you lack physical prowess. Oh, we stopped doing that, though. Jake continued conversationally. Turned out it wasn't really the most efficient way to organize things. We found better methods. The Vextar warrior's compound eyes focused sharply on the human. Better methods? What could possibly be more effective than the strong ruling the weak? Jake took another drink before answering. Well, cooperation mostly. Turns out when you get everyone working together instead of spending all your energy keeping them scared, you can accomplish some pretty amazing things. We went from horse-drawn carriages to space travel in about 200 years once we figured that out. Zach Thull's chitinous plates shifted slightly, a sign of growing agitation. Cooperation is a luxury that only the strong can afford to offer the weak. Without strength to back it up, cooperation is meaningless. Maybe, Jake shrugged, though I've noticed that the beings in here don't seem to be cooperating with you so much as just avoiding you. That's not really the same thing, is it? The observation struck closer to home than Zach Thull cared to admit. It was true that other species typically fled from Vextar rather than willingly working with them. But that was simply the natural order of things. The strong took what they needed, and the weak adapted or perished. Fear is respect, Zach Thull growled. When others see my strength, they understand their place in the hierarchy. This prevents unnecessary conflict. Does it, though? Jake asked, genuinely curious. I mean, if everyone's afraid of you, how do you know if they're telling you the truth about things? How do you make friends? How do you know who you can really trust? The questions were strange ones that Zach Thull had never seriously considered. Vextar society was built on dominance hierarchies and clan loyalty. Trust was earned through displays of strength and maintained through continued demonstrations of power. The concept of friendship, as the human seemed to understand, it was foreign to him. Trust is earned through strength, Zach Thull replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Those who prove themselves in combat earn positions in the clan hierarchy. Jake nodded, but his expression suggested he found this explanation somehow insufficient. What about people who aren't warriors? Like, what if someone's really good at fixing machines, or growing food, or figuring out complex problems? Do they just get ignored because they can't fight? If they cannot fight, they serve those who can, Zach Thull answered automatically. This is the way of things. Huh. Jake finished his drink and signaled the bartender for another. On Earth, our best warriors these days are usually people you'd never pick out of a crowd. Pilots who can fly ships through impossible maneuvers, hackers who can break into any computer system, engineers who can build weapons that would make your claws look like toys. This caught Zach Thull's attention. Despite their small size and apparent fragility, Was this human suggesting that his species possessed advanced military capabilities? Your people are warriors, Zachthal asked, his tone shifting to something approaching professional interest. Some of us, yeah, though we're kind of weird about it. Jake accepted his fresh drink with a nod of thanks to the nervous bartender. We don't really have a warrior class like you seem to. Pretty much anyone might end up fighting if the situation calls for it. Anyone. Zachthal found this concept difficult to grasp. Even the weak? Even those who lack natural fighting ability. Especially them, sometimes. Jake's tone grew more serious. Turns out that when you're smaller and weaker than your opponent, you get really creative about finding ways to win. And humans, well, we can be pretty creative when we need to be. The human paused, looking directly up at Zachthal with an expression that was suddenly much more intense than his previous casual demeanor had suggested. We had this saying back in our military academies. It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Something in the human's tone made Zachthal reassess the small being before him. There was no fear in those strange forward-facing eyes, but there was also no longer the casual friendliness that had characterized their conversation up to this point. Instead, there was something else. Something that reminded Zachthal of the look he'd seen in the eyes of cornered prey animals just before they made their final, desperate attack. Except this human didn't seem cornered or desperate. If anything, he seemed perfectly calm and in control. You speak as though your people have experience with combat against superior opponents, Zachthal observed. Jake smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Superior is a relative term. We've had our share of fights against bigger, stronger opponents. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost, but we always learned something. The cantina around them had grown noticeably quieter. Other patrons had begun to sense the shift in atmosphere between the massive Vextar warrior and the small human. Conversations became more subdued, and several groups of aliens had discreetly moved to tables farther from the bar. Zachthal noticed the change, but attributed it to the usual fear response his presence generated. What he didn't realize was that many of the station's more experienced denizens had learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded violence. The human's relaxed posture combined with the Vextar's increasingly aggressive stance created a familiar tension. You speak of learning from combat, Zachthal said, his voice taking on the formal tone Vextar warriors used when discussing matters of warfare. What could a species as young as yours possibly teach about battle to those who have conquered star systems? Jake considered the question while taking a careful sip of his drink. Well, for one thing, we learned that the biggest, strongest fighter doesn't always win. Sometimes the smart fighter does. Sometimes the lucky fighter does. And sometimes the one who's willing to do whatever it takes wins. Elaborate, Zachthal demanded, his interest clearly piqued despite his dismissive attitude. Take asymmetric warfare, for example. Jake seemed to warm to the topic. When a smaller force fights a larger one, they can't win by following the same rules. They have to change the game entirely. Hit where the enemy is weak, avoid where they're strong, make them fight on your terms instead of theirs. The human gestured casually with his drink as he spoke. We had this conflict once where a bunch of farmers and merchants ended up fighting against what was supposed to be the most powerful military in the world at the time. The professionals had better training, better equipment, better everything. But they lost because they kept fighting like professionals while the farmers fought like farmers. Zachthal's compound eyes focused more intently on the human. Despite his species' emphasis on strength and dominance, Vextar were not stupid. Military tactics and strategy were important components of their warrior culture. How does one fight like a farmer? He asked. By knowing the terrain better than your enemy. By being willing to sacrifice material things to preserve what really matters. By understanding that sometimes retreating to fight another day is smarter than making a glorious last stand. Jake's tone remained conversational, but there was an underlying edge to his words now. And by being absolutely ruthless when it comes to protecting what you care about. The last statement caught Zachthal's attention. Ruthlessness was something his species understood and respected. Perhaps these humans were not as soft as they appeared. Your people understand ruthlessness? Zackthel inquired. Jake nodded slowly. When we need to. We prefer not to, if we have a choice. But when someone threatens our families, our homes, our way of life, well, let's just say we can be very creative about making them regret it. To demonstrate his point, Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that Zackthel didn't immediately recognize. It appeared to be made of some kind of polymer material with metallic components, roughly the size of the human's hand. What is that? Zackthel asked, his warrior instincts telling him that the object might be significant even though it looked harmless. This? Just a communication device. Lets me talk to my ship's AI from anywhere on the station. Jake held the device casually, thumb resting on what appeared to be an activation switch, though it does have some other interesting features built in. Zackthel studied the device more carefully. There is something about the human's manner that suggested the object was more important than he was letting on. What kind of features? The Vextar asked. Jake smiled, and this time the expression was definitely predatory. Well, for instance, it's connected to a rather sophisticated scanning system on my ship. Been analyzing this station's structural integrity, security protocols, life support systems, that sort of thing. Just standard precautions for a human traveling alone in unknown territory. The implications of this statement began to sink in for Zackthel. If the human was telling the truth, his ship had been conducting detailed surveillance of the station while they had been talking. The fact that the station's security systems hadn't detected or prevented such scanning suggested either incompetence on the part of station security or advanced technological capabilities on the human's part. You scan every station you visit? Zackthel asked, his tone becoming more cautious. Every one, Jake confirmed. Like I said, humans can be pretty creative when it comes to survival. We like to know exactly what we're dealing with before we commit to a situation. The human took another drink, apparently unconcerned by the way Zackthel was now studying him with obvious suspicion. For example, did you know that this station's main structural supports run right through the floor beneath us? Or that the atmospheric recycling system has a convenient access panel about 20 feet from where we're sitting? Zachfel's chitinous plates began to shift more noticeably now. The human was describing the kind of detailed intelligence that would be invaluable to someone planning an assault on the station. No casual traveler would need or want such information. You speak as though you are planning an attack, Zackthel observed, his hand moving instinctively toward the plasma weapon holstered at his side. Jake noticed the movement, but seemed completely unperturbed by it. Attack? Oh no, nothing like that. I'm just a trader passing through. But humans have this saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We like to have options available, just in case something goes wrong. The human's casual tone was beginning to unnerve Zackthel in a way that few things ever had. There was something deeply unsettling about facing an opponent who seemed completely unafraid, while simultaneously demonstrating capabilities that suggested such confidence might be justified. What kind of options? Zackthel pressed. Jake's smile broadened slightly. Well, that would depend on the situation, wouldn't it? But, generally speaking, humans are really good at improvising solutions to complex problems. Sometimes those solutions are peaceful. Sometimes they're not. The tension in the cantina had become palpable. Even species that weren't particularly sensitive to predatory behavior could sense that something significant was building between the towering Vextar warrior and the seemingly harmless human. Several groups of patrons had quietly settled their tabs and left, while others had moved as far from the bar as possible while still remaining in the establishment. Zackthel found himself in an unfamiliar position. Throughout his military career, he had faced enemies that were stronger, faster, or more numerous than himself. But he had never encountered an opponent who seemed so completely unconcerned by the threat he represented. The human's casual confidence was beginning to feel less like ignorance, and more like knowledge of something that Zackthel didn't understand. You seem very certain that your improvised solutions would be effective against a Vextar warrior, Zackthel said, his voice carrying a subtle challenge. Jake finished his current drink and set the empty container on the bar with a soft clink. Effective is a relative term, but humans have this advantage that a lot of species seem to lack. we're really good at learning from our mistakes. And we made a lot of mistakes over the years. The human gestured for another drink, but the Nexian bartender seemed reluctant to approach while the two beings were clearly engaged in some kind of confrontation. After a moment, Jake shrugged and continued without the beverage. For instance, Jake said conversationally, "We used to think that having the biggest army or the most advanced weapons automatically meant you'd win any conflict. Took us a while to figure out that wars aren't actually won by armies or weapons. They're won by whoever can sustain their effort the longest while making their opponent's effort unsustainable." Zach Thull's warrior training told him that the human was describing classical siege warfare tactics, but there was something in the way he spoke that suggested broader applications. "You speak of warfare as though it were simply a matter of resource management," Zach Thull observed. "In the long run, that's exactly what it is," Jake replied. "Oh, individual battles can be won through superior strength or better tactics or just plain luck. But wars? Wars are won by the side that can keep fighting after the other side gives up." The human's tone became more serious as he continued. "And humans are really good at not giving up. It's probably our most defining characteristic as a species. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest beings in the universe, but we're stubborn as hell." To illustrate his point, Jake pulled up one sleeve of his jacket, revealing several faded scars on his forearm. "Got these during a mining accident on Kepler 442b about 5 years ago. Cave-in trapped me and 3 other workers for 6 days with no food and barely any water. The other guys, well, they didn't make it." Zach Thull examined the scars with professional interest. They appeared to be from sharp debris, the kind that would result from being trapped in a collapsed tunnel. The fact that the human had survived such an ordeal suggested either exceptional luck or exceptional determination. "How did you survive when the others did not?" Zach Thull asked. "I refused to die," Jake said simply. "Sound dramatic, I know, but that's really all it was. The others gave up hope after the second day. Started talking about how they'd never see their families again, how they were going to die in that hole. I just kept digging." The human flexed his scarred arm experimentally. "Took me 4 days of nonstop excavation with nothing but broken mining tools and my bare hands, but I finally broke through to a service tunnel. Doctors said later that I should have collapsed from exhaustion long before I managed it." Zach Thull was beginning to understand that he might have underestimated this species. Physical strength was not the only form of power, and humans appeared to possess something that might be even more dangerous: an absolute refusal to accept defeat. "Your species has experience with survival situations," Zach Thull acknowledged. "Our entire evolutionary history is basically one long survival situation," Jake replied. "We evolved on a planet that was constantly trying to kill us. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate shifts that would wipe out most of the life on the surface. The only reason we're here today is because our ancestors were too stubborn to die when everything else did." The human paused, looking directly at Zach Thull with those strange, forward-facing eyes. "And that's before you factor in what we did to each other. Humans spent most of our history fighting other humans. We got really good at finding ways to kill things that were exactly as smart and determined as we were." This statement carried implications that Zach Thull was only beginning to grasp. A species that had evolved by competing against itself would have developed capabilities quite different from species like the Vextar, who had achieved dominance primarily through physical superiority over other species. "You wage war against your own kind?" Zach Thull asked, his tone reflecting genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Used to. Still do occasionally, though we've gotten better about finding alternatives." Jake's expression grew distant for a moment. "But yeah, humans have been perfecting the art of killing other humans for thousands of years. We got so good at it that we eventually developed weapons that could destroy our entire planet in a matter of hours." The casual way the human mentioned planetary-scale destructive capability sent a chill through Zach Thull's exoskeleton. Even the Vextar, for all their military might, typically conquered worlds rather than destroying them. Destroying a planet required either massive resources or incredibly advanced technology. You possess weapons capable of planetary destruction? Zachthal asked carefully. Jake nodded. Had them for decades before we developed FTL travel. Kind of a weird development path when you think about it. Most species seem to figure out interstellar travel first and then work on advanced weapons. We did it backwards. The human smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. Probably because we were so focused on finding better ways to kill each other that we almost missed the opportunity to spread beyond our homeworld. Lucky for everyone else that we figured out space travel before we accidentally sterilized our own planet. Zachthal was rapidly reassessing everything he thought he knew about this encounter. The small, seemingly fragile being sitting next to him represented a species that had developed planet-killing weapons as a matter of routine military development. That suggested a level of technological sophistication and strategic thinking that was far beyond what he had initially assumed. And now your people travel the stars, Zachthal observed. Some of us, Jake confirmed. Most humans are still back on Earth or in our local systems. But, yeah, some of us decided to see what else was out here. The human's tone grew thoughtful. Turns out the galaxy is a pretty interesting place. Lots of different species, lots of different ways of organizing societies, lots of different approaches to solving problems. Jake looked around the cantina, taking in the various alien patrons who were trying very hard not to appear as though they were listening to the conversation. Also turns out that most species seem to have settled on variations of the same basic theme. Big and strong rules over small and weak. It's effective, I suppose, but it's not very imaginative. Zachthal felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. Throughout his career as a Vextar warrior, he had been able to categorize every opponent he encountered into familiar patterns. Physical threats could be met with superior strength. Technological threats could be overwhelmed through numbers or tactics. Even psychological warfare followed predictable patterns that Vextar training had prepared him for. But this human defied categorization. Jake Thompson appeared physically weak, claimed to belong to a young species with limited galactic experience, and showed no obvious signs of advanced technology or superior numbers. Yet everything about his demeanor suggested that he considered himself to be operating from a position of strength. You speak as though strength-based hierarchies are somehow inferior, Zachthal said, probing for more information. Yet such systems have proven effective across countless species and civilizations. Jake nodded agreeably. Oh, they work fine for maintaining order and establishing clear chains of command. Very efficient for short-term goals. But they have some significant limitations when it comes to innovation and adaptation. The human gestured around the cantina again. Look around this place. How many new ideas do you think it's shared here? How much genuine cooperation happens between species? Most of these folks are conducting business at arm's length because everyone's too busy figuring out who's dangerous and who's weak to actually work together on anything interesting. Zachthal followed the human's gesture, observing the various alien patrons with fresh perspective. It was true that most interactions in the cantina were brief and formal. Species tended to cluster with their own kind, and negotiations between different groups were typically conducted through intermediaries rather than direct contact. Cooperation requires trust, Zachthal pointed out. Trust requires predictable behavior. Strength-based hierarchies provide that predictability. Do they, though? Jake asked. Or do they just provide the illusion of predictability? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like everyone's constantly trying to figure out where they stand relative to everyone else. That's not really cooperation. It's more like competitive positioning. The human paused to signal the bartender again, and this time the nervous Nexian approached with obvious reluctance. Jake ordered something called Terran whiskey, which the bartender claimed not to have, so he settled for a standard ethanol-based beverage instead. Humans tried the strength-based approach for most of our history. Jake continued once his drink arrived. Kingdoms, empires, military dictatorships, corporate hierarchies based on power rather than competence. They all worked for a while, but they all had the same fundamental problem. Which was? Zachthal asked, despite himself becoming genuinely interested in the human's perspective. They optimized for control rather than results. The strongest person got to make the decisions, regardless of whether they actually knew what they were doing. Innovation happened in spite of the system rather than because of it. Jake took a sip of his new drink and made a face. This tastes like industrial solvent. Zachthal found himself almost smiling at the human's casual complaint. There was something disarmingly normal about the comment that made it difficult to maintain his intimidating presence. You suggest that humans have found a better system? Zachthal inquired. We're working on it. Still got plenty of problems to solve, but we've made progress. Jake set down his drink and turned to face the Vextar warrior directly. The key insight was figuring out that the goal isn't to find the strongest person and put them in charge. The goal is to create systems that bring out the best capabilities in everyone. The human's expression grew more serious. See, when you organize society around strength and dominance, you get really good at those things. But you miss out on everything else. Creativity, empathy, lateral thinking, collaborative problem solving. All the things that actually matter when you're trying to build something that lasts. Zachthal considered this perspective. Vextar society had indeed become extremely efficient at warfare and conquest, but it had produced relatively little in terms of technological innovation or cultural development. Most of their advanced equipment was either captured from conquered species or purchased from neutral trading partners. You believe that cooperation produces better results than competition? Zachthal asked. I believe that the right kind of cooperation produces better results than the wrong kind of competition, Jake replied. Humans still compete with each other all the time. We just try to structure that competition so that everyone benefits from the results rather than just the winners. The human finished his drink despite his earlier complaint about the taste. For instance, right now, there are probably a dozen human research teams competing to develop better FTL drives. They're all trying to outdo each other, but they also share their basic research findings so that everyone can build on everyone else's work. That way, even the teams that don't win still contribute to the overall advancement of the technology. This concept was genuinely foreign to Zachthal's experience. Vextar clans guarded their military secrets jealously, sharing information only when absolutely necessary for clan survival. The idea of deliberately helping competitors seemed counterintuitive. Does this not give your enemies access to your military capabilities? Zachthal asked. Jake's expression shifted slightly, becoming more focused and alert. Well, that depends on how you define enemy, doesn't it? If you assume that everyone who isn't you is automatically a threat, then, yeah, cooperation becomes dangerous. But if you're smart about choosing your partners and building genuine relationships, you can accomplish things that no single individual or group could manage alone. The human leaned back in his chair, but his posture remained ready for action. Of course, there are still genuine threats out there. Species or individuals who are committed to using violence and intimidation to get what they want. In those cases, cooperation means working together to deal with the threat. Something in Jake's tone suggested that Zachthal might want to pay attention to this part of the conversation. And how do cooperative species deal with threats? Zachthal asked carefully. Jake smiled, and this time the expression was definitely predatory. Very, very effectively. See, when you have dozens or hundreds of different groups all working together and sharing information, you can respond to threats in ways that hierarchical systems just can't match. The human pulled out his communication device again, thumb resting on the activation switch. For example, when I walked into this cantina tonight, I transmitted a real-time feed of everything I was seeing and hearing to a network of human ships positioned throughout this sector. By now, they have detailed profiles of everyone in this room, complete tactical assessments of the station's defenses, and contingency plans for approximately 50 different scenarios. Zachthal's compound eyes focused sharply on the device. You have been conducting surveillance this entire time? Standard precaution, Jake replied casually. Like I said, humans are really good at preparing for contingencies. If this conversation had remained friendly, the surveillance data would have been filed away and forgotten. But if things had gone differently, the human's thumb moved slightly on the device's activation switch. Well, let's just say that humans take a very dim view of anyone who threatens our people. We might be cooperative and peaceful by preference, but we're absolutely ruthless when it comes to protecting what we care about. Zachthal realized that he was facing a choice. He could escalate this confrontation and discover firsthand what sort of contingency plans the human had prepared. Or he could reassess the situation and consider whether his usual approach to establishing dominance was really the best strategy in this case. For the first time in his adult life, the Vextar warrior decided that discretion might be the better part of valor. "Your people sound formidable," Zachthal said carefully. Jake's thumb moved away from the device's switch, and his predatory smile softened into something more genuinely friendly. "We try to be, but we'd rather be formidable allies than formidable enemies, if you know what I mean." The human raised his empty glass in a toast-like gesture. "So what do you say, Zachthal? Want to find out what humans and Vextar might be able to accomplish if we work together instead of trying to intimidate each other?" Looking at the small, seemingly fragile being who had just demonstrated capabilities that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about power and strength, Zachthal found himself genuinely curious about the answer to that question. "Perhaps," the Vextar warrior replied slowly, "cooperation might indeed be worth exploring." And in the cantina around them, the other patrons gradually began to relax as they realized that the expected violence was not going to materialize. Instead, they had witnessed something far more significant: the beginning of a new kind of relationship between species that had previously seen each other only as predator and prey. The human had never needed to say, "Hold my beer." Sometimes the most effective demonstrations of strength came not from violence, but from the confident knowledge that violence was unnecessary.